I'm going to wrap the evening up with a fairy tale, if it's known at all, as Snow White and Rose Red. That's how the Grimm Brothers labeled the story. But it was actually published by someone else in the 1700s by Caroline Stahl. And there's some indication that it was actually her story. And the Grimm Brothers made, as they often did, modifications to their version to make it more of what they felt a fairy tale should be. So my version has a greater nod back to Caroline Stahl's version. And I think it still is a fairy tale. Once upon a time, there lived a widow woman with 2 children in a small cottage by the edge of a woods. Now, in front of their cottage, there grew 2 rose trees, one of white roses and one of red. But they had grown up together and become so entwined that you could not tell where one tree ended and the other began. And so it was for the widow's 2 children, who were named after those roses. Snow White was fair and pale, and they preferred to stay indoors, doing the cooking and the baking, spinning the wool, and doing all the needlework from fine embroidery to simple mending. While their sibling, Rose Red, had rosy cheeks and wild hair, for they preferred to be outside as much as possible. They helped repair and keep up the little cottage. They loved to go out into the woods and the meadows and forage. They took care of their abundant garden full of vegetables and flowers. But when Rose Red and Snow White were both done with their chores and their work, they loved nothing better than to play and to be together. And what they most loved was to go into the woods to play and explore. The woods was as comfortable to them as their cottage, and they were never afraid there, for they were well known by all the creatures of the woods. They would go into the woods and they would swap songs with the birds. They would sit in a little clearing playing clapping games and string games with each other, while nearby the deer would graze. And sometimes they would go to the brook that ran through the woods to fish, or they would go to the high hills where the bushes and berries grew, and they would pick berries, and they would see, not far from them, was a mama bear and her cub doing the same, fishing or gathering berries. And they were happy to do so side by side. Mama Bear watching after the siblings as much as her own cub. The only time Rose Red and Snow White were afraid of the woods was when the men came with their guns and their hounds. And then the siblings would stay close to home as the sound of the woods changed to shotguns and howlings of the hounds and the yells of the men. And only when the woods became silent again and the birds began to sing again did Rose Red and Snow White go back into the woods to check on all of their friends there. And it happened that one time, after the men had come to the woods and left, that they went in to the woods and they found there the body of the mama bear. They had just left her there on the forest floor, and her own cub was mewling there beside her, and the siblings were so upset to see this that they reached into their pockets for the apples and nuts that they brought with them to snack on while they were in the woods. And they enticed the cub away from his mother's carcass with those treats. And from then on, every time they went into the woods, they brought something for the cub, surplus from their gardens, leftovers from supper. And they left them for the cub. And that cub started to follow them around through the woods. In fact, one time, the night came upon them faster than they were expecting. And rather than make their way home again in the dark, they curled up together on the mossy forest floor. And that bear cub insisted, pushing a little against them and curling up behind them. And their mother did not worry, for this had happened before, their being caught in the woods with the night, and she knew they were safe. And indeed they were, more so that night. For when they woke up in the morning, they saw where the bear cub was. At their backs, just beyond the bear cub, was a cliff's edge that if they had stumbled over or even rolled over in their sleep at night, they might well have tumbled to their deaths. But the bear cub had kept them safe, just as his mother had kept her eye on them. Well, the seasons passed, and it came to winter. And in the deep, dark heart of winter, the siblings could not go into the woods. For at that time, the snow was so high it reached the windowsills of that little cottage. And even Rose Red had only managed to shovel out a bit of a path, just enough to get to the wood to replenish for their fire. And so the little family stayed close at home, working through the short days. And then, as night came early, their mother told Snow White to bolt the door. And then they came together around the fire. And the mother took off her spectacles and started to tell stories as Snow White spun and Rose Red whittled, until they were suddenly startled by the sound of knocking and scratching at their door, which startled and frightened the siblings. For they rarely had visitors, and certainly not in the dead heart of winter. But their mother said, "Oh, it must be some poor traveler out there on the road caught in this weather. Of course, we must open the door and offer what we can." And so Snow White pulled the bolt away from the door, and Rose Red opened it. And there was no stranger, no traveler there. It was the bear cub, covered head to toe in snow and ice. And as soon as Rose Red had opened up that door, that bear cub came bounding into their cottage and made straight for the fireplace. After closing and bolting the door, Rose Red grabbed the broom and she started to brush off the bear cub while Snow White sat beside the bear cub and took his paws in their hand and carefully got all that little bit of crusty ice from between all the crevices of the bear's paws. They rubbed down the bear with their blankets, and they gave the last bits of leftovers from their supper. And the bear cub fell asleep by the fire and stayed there all winter long, now and again waking up as Snow White or Rose Red would entice the bear with a little bit of leftovers or some sweet. Or sometimes the siblings would just curl up beside the buttercup, and they would all be rolled in together, taking naps by the fire. It was the bear cub, though, that knew first that spring was coming. Rose Red went in and out of the cottage a bit more and went further each day, and the bear cub's nose started to twitch at the smells of growing things. And one morning's Rose Red had opened the door, and the next thing they knew, that bear cub was awake and out the door and bounding towards the woods. And Snow White and Rose Red did not see the cub again, except maybe now and again, brief glances in the woods. But he did not return to the cottage. Now that spring was here, though, they had gone through their wood supply for the winter. So their mother sent Snow White and Rose Red into the woods to collect dry branches and sticks and replenish their supply, for even in spring, the winter or the evenings could be quite cold. And so the siblings went into the woods, and as they were gathering the wood, they saw it a bit in the distance there between the trees. Someone jumping up and down and cursing and spitting and making a terrible racket. And they came up and they saw there beside a fallen tree was a little man, one of the fair folk, a dwarf with a long white beard, but the end of his beard was caught in a crack in that fallen tree. And he was jumping up and down and cursing and spitting. "Oh, my goodness, what has happened?" cried out Rose Red. "What do you mean, what has happened? Can you not see I am caught? I have been trying to get myself a little wood. I only need a little bit. I didn't need this whole tree. So I started to cut into it. I made a nice wedge, but the tree just popped that wedge right out and here to know I'm stuck here, and you nincompoops are just asking me what happened and not helping me." Well, at once, Snow White and Rose Red ran forward to see what they could do to help the dwarf. But as much as they tried to pull, and the dwarf cursed at them for pulling, the beard would not move out of that crack. Rose Red even tried to wedge in that wedge again to pry it open, but it popped right out again too, until Snow White put their hand in their pocket and pulled out their sewing scissors. Snip at the bottom of his beard, and he was free. "What have you done to me? You've maimed me, you horrible children! Oh, how what do you call this helping?" And the dwarf just cursed and complained and reached down to the ground where there was a satchel that the siblings had not noticed till that moment that seemed to be spilling out jewels and diamonds, and he pulled it tight and off he went with his sack without a word of thanks. Well, Rose Red and Snow White took their sticks and wood back home, along with the story of their adventure to their mother. And she was well pleased that they had given help to the dwarf, even if he had not been thankful. Well, as the seasons passed again into summer and the long, hot, sticky days, Snow White and Rose Red decided they wanted to go to the brook to fish for their supper and, well, truth be told, probably get their feet cooled off in the brook's water. And so they went with their fishing rods into the woods up to the brook. And as they were getting close, they saw, well, it seemed like an enormous grasshopper of some sort, because it kept jumping towards the water and then jumping back, jumping towards the water and jumping back. But as they got closer, they realized it wasn't a grasshopper. It was their old friend, that ungrateful dwarf. He, too, had had the same idea of going fishing. Only he had been fishing with his long beard. Well, the ends were cut off, but it was still quite long, and it had gotten tangled in the fishing line. And now that there was a fish on the edge of the hook, well, that fish was trying to bring that dwarf into the water, even as the dwarf kept trying to get the fish on land. But since the chin hairs were all tangled up in that line, oh, he was being pulled and pulled and pulled. Well, Snow White and Rose Red knew better than to ask him what had happened. Snow White ran forward, put her arms around his waist, and held him as tight as she could to keep him on the bank, while he complained about, "Oh, you're squeezing me, I can't breathe." And Rose Red ran around to the front to try and untangle his beard from the line. And as they were pulling the beard away, the dwarf kept complaining, "Ah, ouch!" Until finally, Snow White reached into their pocket, pulled out their sewing scissors, gave them to Rose Red, and Rose Red went snip and snip, snip and snip and snip and snip, until finally the dwarf was free. "Oh, what have you done to me? You've disfigured me. I cannot show my face again amongst my own kind, you horrible children. Now I have no fish to eat, and I have no face to show." And he grabbed hold of a satchel on the ground, which appeared to have gold coins spilling out of it, but he tightened it quickly, and off he went without a word of thanks. Well, the siblings were already at the brook, and clearly there were fish ready to be taken. So they stayed to fish until they got enough for their supper, and they went back home with the fish and the tail to their mother. Summer, too, passed, though, and as the days grew shorter, their mother sent Snow White and Rose Red into town to stock up and get some more needles, an assortment of threads, so they would be able to keep themselves busy during the cold days of winter. As Rose Red and Snow White were walking down the road past the woods, there on a hill at the edge of the woods, they saw something glittering. And as they stopped to look, they saw, why, it was their old friend, that ungrateful dwarf, counting out some treasured diamonds and pearls and gold coins and silver coins. And, well, he seemed to be in no harm, so they quickly went by without trying to catch his eye. and they went into town and got what they needed. As they came back and were just about the same spot where they had spied the dwarf on their way out, they noticed up above a great eagle circling round and round. She was clearly looking for prey. And then the next moment, she dove right over the heads of the siblings. Oh, and she got the dwarf. So, of course, Rose Red and Snow White ran up the hill. They each grabbed hold of a leg of that dwarf, pulling him down. Oh, no, let me go. You're hurting me. You're hurting me. Ah, let me go, you fools. And the eagle was still trying to take now all three of them away until finally she gave up for a lost cause and let go. And all three tumbled to the ground. Oh, what have you done to me? Look at me. I am bruised and battered and maimed. My clothes are all ripped. What kind of menace are you? And he was just berating those poor siblings who had been trying to help him. That at first he did not hear the growling coming out from the woods, until there was in front of them, right before them, this enormous, great, big bear. Oh, no, 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 no. You don't want to eat me. I'm much too strong to eat these poor children right here. And he threw the children at the bear. But the bear paid no attention to Rose Red and Snow White, but bounded straight at that dwarf, and with one great blow struck that dwarf dead upon the ground. Well, Snow White and Rose Red had never before been afraid of anything but the men who came into their woods. But they were afraid of this strange bear until they saw that he was gathering all of the dwarf's treasure and putting it at their feet. And then they looked into the bear's eyes, and they recognized their friend, the bear cub, all grown up. And they hugged and kissed the bear, who insisted that they take all of that treasure home with them. And so they did, to their mother, with the tale of all that had happened. And their mother took that money, that treasure from the dwarf, and she bought the woods. And from that day on, all who lived in the woods and all who lived in the cottage lived comfortably, peacefully, and happily ever after.